It's a city jail complex so notorious, it's been making headlines for all the wrong reasons.
What are some words you'd use to describe Rikers Island?
Hell. Plain and simple, hell.
Prisons are undoubtedly some of the most violent places in the world. A violent atmosphere seems inevitable with the world's most dangerous criminals together in one place. Today we bring you 10 of the most dangerous prisons in the world and explain precisely what makes them so unsafe. Number 10. La Modelo, Colombia. La Modelo Prison consists of two wings. The north wing holds left-wing rebels, and the south holds right-wing government supporters. On April 27, 2000, over 100 lives were lost due to a fight. After the incident, the government began to change the prison regime. Ironically, the prison staff does not carry weapons inside the prison, even though the inmates can access various weapons. Outnumbered 13-1, the guards have very little control over inmates inside the prison. Only 2 guards are assigned to each section during the day and 1 during the night. They reportedly cannot even enter places like Patio 2 without permission from the estimated 150 inmates who control the cell block. In March of 2020, a riot broke out within the prison due to fear of COVID-19 spreading among inmates. That riot took 23 lives and left 83 injured. Inmates across the country have been protesting overcrowding and poor health services ever since the outbreak of COVID-19. This prison is different from others as they don't separate the inmates. Paramilitaries, corrupt cops, drug traffickers, ordinary inmates, and dealers share the same cells and courtyards. With the amount of violence, weapons, and criminals, it's no surprise that this prison is so dangerous. Number 9. Tadmor Prison, Syria. Tadmor Prison was home to thousands of political and criminal Syrian inmates in the barren desert of Syria during the 1980s. In addition to brutality, Tadmor was also notorious for its extreme climate conditions. Without warning or motive, inmates faced brutal suffering that regularly resulted in their deaths. To receive confessions during interrogations, inmates faced punishment from guards using various objects. According to a Palestinian writer who spent 2 years there, it's utterly unfair to call it prison. In prison, you have basic rights, but in Tadmor, you have nothing. You're only left with fear and horror. Suspected Islamic inmates faced the harshest treatment possible. They were so horrible that they couldn't mention it in this video. Eye contact in this prison was strictly forbidden. Inmates were not allowed to raise their heads, look up, or look at each other. In an attempt to stand up against the horrible treatment they received, the inmates came together to form their version of a democracy, a behavior uncommon for most inmates. Military officers were innovative in finding new methods to humiliate inmates. They resorted to strange and revolting forms of torture, sometimes just out of boredom. Once, a guard ordered an inmate to move about 100 pairs of slippers using only his mouth. Each morning, guards would select an inmate to rat out 10 others that hadn't slept on their side at the correct position. The prisoner refused to give names, and they would punish him. And then 10 other men received the same punishments if they, too, didn't supply names. Overall, the harsh conditions and extensive human rights abuse that inmates faced makes this prison so dangerous. In June of 1980, a massacre occurred in the prison as soldiers stormed the cells and took the lives of 500 to 800 inmates in just a few minutes. After numerous reports of brutality and torture, the prison was shut down in 2001. Number 8. ADX Florence, USA. ADX Florence is an American federal prison in Fremont County near Florence, Colorado. Prison was created after brutal incidents occurred at other federal prisons. The government needed higher-level security prisons to house the most dangerous and notable criminals in the United States. The facility has a total capacity of 551 inmates and a population of 322 inmates, such as criminal leaders of various violent gangs and domestic and international terrorists from influential organizations like Al-Qaeda. This Supermax prison is known for its harsh conditions, with inmates in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. The hour that they are allowed out is into a larger cell with vaulted ceilings called the empty swimming pool. This room has a 4-inch by 4-foot skylight that was the only window to prevent the inmates from knowing where they are, so it's virtually impossible to plan an escape. Most inmate contact occurs through a slot door, such as meals and healthcare, instead of being taken into infirmary or having a corrections officer open the door to bring in the food tray. Not only drastically reduces the inmate's chances of escaping, but also reduces possible injuries to corrections officers and nurses. There's no contact between the inmates whatsoever. Even though the diagram shows inmate beds side by side, the concrete construction of the prison prevents them from talking to each other through the wall or even tapping on it in Morse code. The sink and shower have special drains constructed to prevent any kind of feedback so they can't talk to each other through the pipes. All these efforts prevent inmates from planning any escape. The prison has a multitude of motion detectors and cameras, 1,400 remote-controlled steel doors, and 12-foot-high razor wire fences. As an added level of security, laser beams, pressure pads, and attack dogs guard the area surrounding the prison's outlying fences. Conditions are harsh but considered fair given these inmates' crimes. The prison operates under the strategy of sensory deprivation and solitude. Inmates are left to their thoughts, often leading to hallucinations, memory loss, and increasingly irritable behavior. Despite the extreme security measures to deter disruptive, violent, and dangerous behavior among inmates, there still have been deaths at ADX, making this place so dangerous. Number 7. La Santé Prison, France. La Santé Prison in southern Paris is one of France's most famous prisons, with VIP and maximum security sections. The prison consists of 2 levels, the upper and the lower. Until 2000, the inmates were racially segregated. There was a block for Western Europe, Black Africa, North Africa, and the rest of the world. The prison was built in 1867 with 500 cells, eventually expanding to 1,000 cells designed to accommodate 2,000 inmates, and was a site of public executions until 1939. The prison is so brutal, many inmates take their own lives instead of serving out their sentences. In 1999, 124 inmates ended up taking their own lives. Most of the atrocities at La Santé went unreported and ignored by the guards until Veronica Vasseur's report. Vasseur worked as a doctor in prison and began writing her experiences in a diary to record the unbelievable conditions these inmates had to endure. The book shocked the public and provoked a parliamentary evacuation of the situation. Vasseur claimed 4 inmates were squeezed into a cell for up to 23 hours daily. They were forced to sleep in dirty mattresses, crawling with bugs, and had to fill cracks in their cells with clothing to keep rats from flooding their cells. The prison system also creates a hierarchical prison systems has inmates that influence others too, making the conditions worse for the weaker inmates. Vasseur saw many inmates begin to go insane with the inhumane conditions they were forced to be living in. The hygiene was unbearable, allowing only 2 showers a week despite the extreme 100-degree conditions that the inmates endured. The most depressing aspect of the prison was how overcrowded it was. As recently as 2013, Étienne Noël, a prominent lawyer and advocate for inmates' rights in France, published infuriated reports that La Santé, each prisoner, had no more than 2 square meters to himself. The maximum security cells are even more claustrophobic, tight compartments where you can almost stretch your arms and touch both walls simultaneously. Overcrowding was a significant factor in inmates ending their lives. It was also a great incentive to escape. Probably the most notable of all the escapes from La Santé was the Michael Vajor in 1986, whose wife Nadine swooped into the courtyard to snatch him up in a helicopter she was piloting. Number 6. Camp 14 Kaesyeon, North Korea. Near the middle of North Korea is a 60-square-mile prison facility known as Camp 14, or Kaesyeon. North Korea built Camp 14 in 1959 near the country's center, about 40 miles north of Pyongyang. Camp 14 is considered a political prisoner camp and can hold 15,000 inmates, all serving life sentences for being enemies of the state. Like all political prison camps in North Korea, Kaesyeon segregates inmates from the general prison population. The country considers them unredeemable because they have committed political crimes and punishes them for those crimes through unending hard labor. Those sent to the camp include officials deemed to have performed poorly in their job. People have criticized the government and anyone suspected of engaging in anti-government activities. However, some of these inmates are victims of the regime's 3 generations of punishment. 3 generations of a prisoner's families are also sent to the camp and have to spend their whole lives there without committing a crime themselves. Economic activities that employ inmates as slave labor, including mining, textiles, farming, and raising livestock. Inmates in the camp are required to work for long periods, often from 5:30 a.m. to midnight. Children are not exempt either. They have to work after school and rarely see their parents. Induced starvation is common among these inmates, who become so desperate that they catch and eat rodents, frogs, and snakes, even resorting to cannibalism. Unsurprisingly, many pass from malnourishment, illnesses, and work accidents, and the after effects of torture. The total control zone is a life sentence, with death as the only exit. Shin Dong-hyuk was the only known prisoner who escaped in 2005. In one of his recounts, he overheard his mother conspiring to help his brother escape and had to report it to his teacher. Later, he had to watch as officers took his mother and brother's lives. Survival meant living by the rules, which included exposing anyone in breach of camp regulations, making this camp so dangerous. Number 5. Rikers Island, USA. Ranked as one of the 10 worst prisons in America, Rikers Island in the Bronx contains New York City's largest jail. The New York City Department of Correction operates the jail. Most detainees are pretrial defendants, either held on bail or remanded in custody, while the rest of the population have been convicted and are serving short sentences. As of December 9, 2022, 5,869 people were waiting for their day in court in the dehumanizing conditions of New York City jails. Of them, 1,077 have been waiting for a trial for over a year. Inside these hellish chambers, inmates had insufficient access to fundamental human rights. They had to live in dirty cells, and food routinely ran out. There was little to no access to fresh air, toilets, toilet paper, showers, or medical care, and inmates were denied visits with their attorneys and trips to the courthouse for hearings on their pending cases. Some of the only water detainees could drink were from tiny sinks inside the pens. Without cups, they used their unwashed hands to scoop up sips or put their mouths under their faucets. Corruption had been long a problem, and the wardens in charge of this dangerous prison easily bribed. They often used excessive force on inmates for no reason other than because they can. But it's not just the guards, with the inmates regularly fighting each other. A report detailed 9,424 incidences that took place in the prisons since 2015. Reports have been written about the abuse and maltreatment of the mentally ill and LGBTQ inmates in this prison. In 2022 alone, 16 lives were taken in this jail. Some detainees took their own lives, while some passed from lack of medical attention. Either way, these were all a result of the horrific conditions in Rikers Island. Number 4. Attica Correctional Facility, USA. Attica Correctional Facility in New York is one of the last big house prisons built in the United States. New York State officials believe this would solve the problems they were experiencing with inmates in the wake of a series of severe riots in state prisons in 1929. Conditions for inmates at Attica were harsh, with inmates spending at least 14 hours each day in their cells. Cramped cells, lousy food, inadequate medical care, minimal recreation, and lack of employment contributed to dehumanizing conditions and eventually one of the most destructive riots. The corrections officers from a local community, primarily white men raised in rural New York, with only one being Hispanic. Prison authorities banned political organizations and were particularly hostile to black Muslims, banning them from holding religious services. These, coupled with the horrible living conditions, created a sense of tension that saturated the prison community. After long simmering inmate complaints of racial bias and poor conditions, a riot began in the overcrowded prison. Inmates listed 33 demands, including better medical treatment, religious freedom, higher wages for inmate jobs, and necessities such as toothbrushes and daily showers. The negotiations would eventually break down, replaced by these and other forces' armed retaking of the prison. On September 9, 1971, more than 1,200 inmates took dozens of hostages. The riot ended after 4 days and 43 lives were lost, of which 33 were convicts, while the rest were prison staff. The aftermath of the bloody raid, authorities pinned the deaths on the hostages on the inmates. However, autopsies showed that these charges were false and that all 10 hostages had their lives taken by police. The attempted cover-up increased public condemnation of the raid and prompted a congressional investigation. The Attica uprising became a watermark in United States correctional history, mainly because the intensive press coverage and liberal criticism of the assault made people across the country aware of the uprising and the conditions that led to it. Broadcasters saw the events as evidence of a need for sweeping changes in corrections policies and a greater need to recognize inmates' rights. Number 3. Ciudad Barrios Prison, El Salvador. Peñas Ciudad Barrios is located in El Salvador, Central America. El Salvador is considered one of the most violent places in the world. From January to August 2015, the country recorded 4,246 homicides, an average of 17.5 per day. The number was 67% more the following year, so it makes sense that it houses some of the most dangerous criminals in the world too. To give you an idea of how dangerous this prison is, Ciudad Barrios is a maximum security prison created to house the most dangerous gang in the country exclusively, the Mara Salvatrucha gang. Not even the police dared to stay inside the prison facilities. Full of arms, drug dealers, murderers, and members of other gangs, Peñas Cuidados Barrios houses 800 inmates. However, today the place has over 2,500 inmates. Guards have little control over the prison, given a prisoner-to-guard ratio is 50-1. The gang runs the prison internally, and authorities avoid meeting with the other inmates' internal problems. The fear of this place is so prominent that the prison today operates as a small independent city. Ciudad Barrios has a bakery, hospital, workshops, and rehabilitation center. However, the big problem is that criminals have nothing to do daily. Sometimes they spend their times distracting themselves with games, others with sports, and they have so much downtime for the most part. To no one's surprise, the gang deals with drugs, prostitution rings, and protection rackets, and carried out armed robberies. Many gang members' faces are tattooed to prove their lifelong commitment. The turf wars are brutal, with gangs often targeting their rivals' family members. The relentless tit-for-tat murders between El Salvador's two most significant street gangs, Calle 18 and Mara Salvatrucha, made the country most murderous in the world. In 2013, a London photographer, Adam Hinton, took photos of Ciudad Barrios' inmates' photos in 2013, which soon became famous worldwide. According to him, most inmates are from barrios or slums. This place is without hope or opportunity in El Salvador, and the gang is the only real option. He describes the feeling inside the complex as total abandonment, void of hope. Number 2. La Sabaneta Prison, Venezuela. Described as the gateway to the fifth circle of hell by former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, La Sabaneta certainly lives up to the reputation. Not only does it have one of the world's highest homicide rates, but the country's jails are so overbrimming with murderers, a dark reality has left La Sabaneta with just one guard for every 150 inmates. This prison in Venezuela was built to only hold a maximum of 1,500 inmates, but houses up to 2,500. Of this number, an estimated 192 were inmates' children. Typical of a Venezuelan prison, it's severely overcrowded with inadequate access to medical care, food, and clean water. And violence among inmates was very common. Inmates had to sleep in hammocks, and diseases like cholera were very typical in La Sabaneta due to the unsanitary conditions. Inmates had to bathe from the same buckets of water, go to the toilet in plastic bags they tossed out of windows, and drink straight out of the corroded bathroom pipes. Prison was run by inmates, followed the trend of 80% of Venezuelan prisons. The corrupt prison system allows wealthier inmates to pay off the guards and run the prison. They can buy themselves favors and larger cells while the poorer inmates suffer. The most powerless residents, the Los Angeles, have been known to stitch their mouths shut for protection, adhering to the prison code, "One who sews his own lips, no one can kill him." Regardless, fearsome riots have plagued the prison over the decades. While the governmental control over the prison was weak, raids by government forces yield massive amounts of weapons and drugs. One raid even discovered a collection of jungle animals in prison, including a few endangered species. On January 3, 1994, a riot broke out in the prison due to ongoing gang activity and led to the deaths of approximately 150 inmates. Another 2013 riot also claimed the lives of 16. The corrupt guards were mainly to blame, as they allowed weapons smuggling and essentially encouraged prison violence. The extreme violence within these walls led to the prison's closure after 55 years of operation. Iris Varela, who was the prison's minister then, said that the incident had been the result of an internal war within the prison. Number 1. Carandiru Penitentiary, Brazil. Carandiru Penitentiary in Brazil, South America, was undoubtedly the most violent and deadly prison in the world, and the place of one of the most considerable human rights violations in the history of Brazil. The penitentiary was designed to be built by Samuel da Neves in 1920, when it was considered a model prison to fulfill the new demands of the 1890 Criminal Code. The prison became so overcrowded by the end of the 20th century that inmates operated by their own rules, overthrowing the few guards that worked there. During the peak of its use, this prison had over 8,000 inmates, even though it only had the capacity for 4,000, with only 1,000 prison officers attempting to contain them. Conditions inside the walls were frankly horrific. Malnutrition, diseases, and injuries were typical and treated by the little medical staff that they had, usually without using any painkillers. Conditions were so bad that most inmates had HIV and other transmittable diseases. These conditions only came to light after a renowned Brazilian physician wrote a book about his 12-year-long tenure as a volunteer physician from 1989 to 2001. In addition, a simple fight between two inmates over a soccer game in 1992 resulted in a prison riot. Because the sheer number of inmates overpowered the police, they refused to intervene out of fear, Instead, they sent military police, which stormed the prison and led to the deaths of 111 inmates, including innocent inmates. Mishandling of this situation brought a great revolution within the country. It not only emphasized the prison crisis that's been affecting Brazil, but also the need to reform the criminal justice system as a whole. Despite officers failing to handle the situation appropriately, none of the officers were arrested. The operations commanding officer was initially sentenced to 632 years in prison, but after several mistrials, he was released to freedom and ended up being assassinated in 2006. Today, the PCC has more than 11,000 members, about 3/4 imprisoned, and is one of Brazil's most powerful criminal organizations. Stricter sentences or more brutal conditions do not do well in controlling these inmates, but rather inspire them to retaliate against the police and civilians. The prison was demolished in 2001, but the legacy still lives in its last standing wing. It was adapted into a public museum and aimed to preserve a part of the prison that tells the story of one of the world's most brutal prisons. Though prisons are undoubtedly some of the most violent places in the world, one trend that we can see throughout these prisons is that dehumanizing conditions contribute to more violence. Thanks for watching this video, and we'll see you in the next one.